Welcome back to the Better Learning Podcast. My name is Jessica Westerduin, Education Market Leader for K-12. Today we are joined by James Liebman, Senior Associate at HMFH Architects. James brings many years in the industry as an architect and project manager. In today's conversation, we'll explore James's architect and leadership journey and discuss how we can foster students' well-being using good educational architect. Thank you so much for joining us, James.
Hi, Jessica. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Can you please tell us about yourself and how you got involved with designing educational spaces?
I have been working in architecture for about 30 years, and most of that has been in education, although prior to my years at HMFH, a lot of it was higher ed, be it complicated renovations to, science facilities for sciences and lab buildings. My first project out of school was actually a kind of a district, a renovation of 6 buildings and additions to 6 buildings at the University of Pennsylvania with Venturi Scott Brown and Associates. And that was sort of my first experience professionally, but also my first experience in the education space. And I remember being struck by the opportunity to really engage with a wide variety of diverse and complicated and different spaces that added spatial complexity to the whole, which was, really exciting. My role was highly technical, but it was that capacity to engage with multiple kinds of spaces that got me pretty excited about educational space.
Yeah, do you remember anything about that process on your first project that maybe stays with you throughout the 30
I
years?
remember working ridiculous hours. But
You were low on
also,
the totem pole.
yeah, I was fresh out of school, but I also kind of really figuring out the details, really getting down to how does each component move and work, and how is that going to impact the user experience was a key part of what I was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we think, we're working in these K to 12 or higher ed, which I do want to circle back to in a few more questions because I have such a perspective and curiosity about how to bring in students at a higher ed level. But before we get there, we really talk about K to 12. You're part of this design community and you're designing for many, many learners. And so, in your own words, what does it mean to be radically student centered or to base decisions on the students that you're impacting?
I mean, ultimately, as you're designing for I'll say pre-K to 12, the student is central to every decision because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately they're the ones that are going to be impacted. So whether it's creating great classrooms that are meaningfully connected to views and have meaningful natural light, right? These are decisions that, may have some impact on the bottom line, but for the most part, really are more about the user experience, that have flexibility um, in their technology, flexibility in their furniture. All of that revolves around how it's going to be used and how it's going to be most useful to the kids that are there. K to 12 is a wide range, right? A
Mm-hmm.
kindergartner and a 12th grader are nothing alike. And so their needs are very different, and the classrooms you design for them are very different.
Mm-hmm. And that uniqueness to each individual. I love the user experience. That's a great way to think about it because as an educator, when we think user, we have to expand what user means and what that means for, like you said, a kindergartner versus a 12th grader versus a fourth grader navigating the same, kind of spaces. And you've been a part of projects in so many projects in Pennsylvania. I heard Massachusetts. Your firm, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Can you share a project or something that stuck with you about being radically student centered, right? So maybe a project that you think about all the time, or a project that truly made an impact with the community.
I think it opened in 2023, so it was in construction during COVID. The Maria Weston Chapman Middle School in Weymouth, Massachusetts. It is a middle school, three grades, 6 through 8. It's the largest middle school in the state at a design enrollment of 14. I think it was 1475. So it's a big middle school. And once that decision was made to bring those grades together and build for every middle schooler in the city, and therefore build the largest middle school in the state, that really pushed us into thinking hard about what's good for students, what's good for student well-being, and how to design for students. And so there was a lot of thought at the district level and at the educational planning level, sort of at the beginning of the process, around how we can build a middle school that's different and that can serve as a feeder into the career technical programs at the high school. And so ultimately, the program included a number of spaces that gave students opportunities to really tap into their interests and spark their interests. And these ranged from a broadcast studio, black box theater, robotics lab, a commercial culinary lab, right? And again, this is a middle school. And the culinary lab is a great story unto itself, because it was really equipment driven. The district wanted a space to teach culinary and to teach nutrition, and they wanted students to use it all the time. So the equipment needed to be commercial equipment, and that decision, because the residential equipment, even the high end residential equipment, just wasn't going to last, and they weren't going to have funds for replacement. So we used commercial equipment that operated as close to home equipment and residential equipment as we could. Anyway, that decision to use commercial equipment then drove the program, and now they have a commercial culinary lab and they use it. They cater events. We had a tour, and we had a tour for the building, for the architecture community, and the students set out a great spread and catered the entire event, which was really very cool. It's very satisfying to see.
That is absolutely. I'm so interested. I've had so many conversations about bringing CTE into middle school to give students the opportunity to play around and explore with all the different avenues before you get to high school and have to like really kind of make that decision. And so I really appreciate the thought that went into that when creating that middle school. That is a lot of students. What was the community kind of thoughts, ideas, barriers, maybe fears going into that? Because that could definitely, I mean, that impacts so many avenues, right?
There was a tremendous amount of support. That was a project that passed its vote in the 70%. There really was a lot of support. The barriers were internal. We knew that was a large middle school, and the middle school is
very low.
They can be difficult years, and providing spaces, that really felt like they were for those kids mattered. We worked with the district, and were really able to define what we started calling concentric rings of support. And so smaller communities within slightly larger communities within slightly larger communities. So each, and some of it's obvious and some of it is, school management, but it did manifest itself architecturally. Each grade is in its own academic wing that kind of radiate out from a central cafeteria, large open cafeteria, themed as a town square. So each grade has its own wing. It's a 2-story building, so the grades split across the 2 floors to create small, again, smaller, breaking down that larger community. Yeah. Each grade is also split into 4 teams. There's 2 teams per floor for each grade, except for at the 6th grade where there's more teams. It's more smaller teams. So each group is split into about 100 kids.
Wow.
And that is their core community. And they identify with that community, both through use of color and naming and, the teachers themselves. And then they're part of this larger community of their floor and the larger community of their grade. the scheduling was really critical, and we were working closely with the principal, who was amazing, and he developed a schedule that allowed for all the students within a grade to be going to these CTE feeder labs or to the gym or to exploratories
Mhm.
at the same time. And that provided an opportunity for all the teachers to collaborate, but it
Yeah.
also kept the grades, right? Everybody was moving to those things in their grade cluster and then back into their academic wing while the next grade came out. So there was not a lot of, say, sixth graders freely roaming while the eighth graders are finding their classrooms. I think that was part of it, but this idea of smaller and smaller communities and supports around those communities. The other thing is that that school included what we called a wraparound services center, which provides community care,
Hmm.
low bar medical, right? So like eyeglass checks and things like that. It also is sort of the central location where programs that help distribute food for students and other sort of family-wide supports come out of that part of the building.
Which is wonderful to offer because in schools, when the school day really feels like it ends at 3:45, and it's like that division of like, school, my school work is over and now it's time to have fun. It's such a negative way to think about school, and having those type of opportunities gets them in the building, right? Like when
Right,
we have students who want to be in the building, then we have done our jobs, as like educators. And I love the small community because I think about a transition like that. Think about those. I believe you said it was fourth, fifth, sixth, like the third,
it's six, seven, eight.
six, seven, eight. So the fifth grade to sixth grade transition, that could feel overwhelming for any student without having that like small community. Like this is my whole school, and I'm a part of the biggest. I'm sure that was amazing. The biggest
Right,
school, the largest school. You have that competition. We love that drive, but then to feel like that necessity of the vision, and when you had that process of like the school, we need to create something for the small communities, I think is so important for the students, because I do think of that when we invest in design, in one school, and we're not able to do all schools at the same time. How do we transition students to go from maybe a traditional way of thinking to this more progressive idea?
right.
And I think the small communities is a wonderful job, and it brings me to this visioning process. And you have a few references, a few claim to fames, James. One being that your ability to create and facilitate a very clear design with stakeholders is something that you are very good at and talented at. And so, how do you, not only for this project, which I'm sure had a lot of stakeholders, but how do you ensure that trust and collaboration when you have projects over multiple years? How do you ensure that trust and collaboration with your clients?
Comes from being consistent and from working with them over time.
Mm.
And so it takes that process, letting them know that we hear them, bringing back evidence that they've been heard, letting them know that this isn't their only opportunity to get their ideas out and that
Mm.
we will be back, and making sure that they're aware of the roadmap, that we start with big picture decisions and we work our way into the nuts and bolts, and that they don't need to tell us about the nuts and bolts on the first meeting, and that we develop as much as we can a durable consensus around the big decisions, so that those create the anchor for everything that follows.
Yeah, absolutely. And the evidence, right, of being heard, I think is so important. I love that you mentioned that too, because, it's not just data all the time, but a lot of the times, I mean, a superintendent is running a school at the same time as the project. Like that's not their main focus. And not having that clear vision, that clear alignment, you see so many missed opportunities or so many decisions made, years later. They're like, this wasn't the best decision, and now
Right.
that's what it is. And so having that evidence that like, here's where we are, let's visually see, are we behind, in front, where are we going, I think is completely important for you for us to be able to do with our clients, just to build that trust, because they're leaving it in our hands. Right.
Well, and they need to be able to make decisions and move on. right? And not feel that they need to revisit those decisions again and again, both because it will hinder the process, but also it it has to be anxiety producing. I'm always, you mentioned superintendents. I'm always amazed by superintendents. Superintendents have so many jobs. Co-guiding a building project is just one of them. The commitment of every superintendent I've ever worked with
Mhm.
is mind blowing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to be thinking about, new people coming into that environment too and how to support them. It's really, we talk about change management, in my role a lot because that's like it's kind of like that invisible thing that comes along with these projects is, if you build it, doesn't mean they necessarily come. They really need to be, them being teachers and students and community need to be brought along the process, or they have this
Right.
thing that they just don't know how to interact with, right? And so how do you kind of balance, when you're in meetings with superintendents, you have budget, you have functionality, you have longevity that you're thinking about. How do you balance all of that when you're in these conversations?
Functionality has to come first, right? It has to work. And it has to, and you mentioned longevity. It has to work for, it has to work for a long time. And
Mhm.
that means, robust materials, things that aren't going to break, sort of ease of operation, but it also means adaptability. Just because something works today doesn't mean it's going to be what they need 10 years from now. And that's evident um, in school design as you look at your projects from even the recent past. Adaptability is tricky because there's nothing more adaptable than just endless space, but we can't build endless space, as you
Mhm.
did mention budget, and space costs dollars. So adaptability adaptability means good technology, and space for adaptive technology. It means great furniture that can be moved. It also means sort of a good sequence of spaces so that just because you've got a great classroom, if you don't have maybe a breakout space or other educational opportunities nearby, that doesn't lead to great adaptability either. So adaptability doesn't just mean lots of space, and really the key is to find ways to not overbuild, or projects will never pass their funding votes. So you're looking for other ways to make sure that it's always functional for the life of the building, which we hope. We say it's 50 years, but if they're well maintained, and they usually are, it's well beyond 50 years. It's often double that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can predict that some of those conversations are rather hard too when you're really focusing on functionality and safety. And you want to see the bells and whistles. They want to see the new furniture pieces and the amazing welding table that's coming out. And having to balance that conversation, definitely one begins with that trust to be able to
Right.
say like, we're going to pause that for the next meeting because we're really thinking about student behavior or whatever the subject is at the time. But it's hard. It's hard to balance that and to navigate that. And we in Massachusetts, we have systems in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. That we don't, go, AWOL with budgets or functionalities or funding. You want to talk a little bit about your projects and working with the MSBA and kind of how you navigate that system as well.
So let me start with just a little bit about what the MSBA is. So the we're talking about the Massachusetts School Building Authority. School building is funded through this state agency, who receives their funding from our sales tax. 1% of our sales tax funds the building of schools in Massachusetts. So that's a constant funding stream. They fund projects based on need. So there's a scale of the percent of construction, and there's all sorts of funding caps. But anyway, the key to it is that they're giving funding to districts and towns and cities to help them build schools that are appropriate for education, for their educational needs. And so the first step is always a district-wide educational plan that we help to facilitate in the early phases of design. And that is really the opportunity for the district to define exactly what it is that their education will deliver and what they need to deliver it. It's through that document, that very early design document, that we, as educators, as designers of educational facilities, can start to lay out and define spaces outside of the sort of standard template. It's with that document that we can talk to the MSBA and go outside of their guidelines. Districts are often looking for things that are specific to their needs. Every district has very different educational needs, particularly around special education. That's where we see the widest sort of variety of needs, but also around number of physical education spaces, maker spaces, other educational opportunities like these CTE feeder labs that I was speaking of at Maria Weston Chapman Middle School. So it's that document, that early educational visioning that really defines the spatial needs and ultimately the architecture for the building that then gets designed around those requirements.
Absolutely. It does, because I think, it's important for us to name that vision process, not only how important it is, but that the questions, and like sometimes you're really digging into specific student behavior, but that's what we're really trying to change with these new buildings is the student behavior, teacher behavior. And so I feel like I love the word artifacts. That's just like a teacher in me. So like that, using that artifact with the MSBA or that, document those standards, it requires everyone at the table, whoever, I know that the MSBA, you're still in that bidding process, but it requires us to be thoughtful and to have this kind of predictability for students and for families that I think is really important in education, that you're going to have those maker spaces, or it's going to be, your athletic facilities is really going to be thought about if you're, someone who really enjoys that special education, curriculum and programming is really being thought about. And so I take those type of kind of systems that we have as like ensuring that everyone is having to some degree an experience that is similar or at least a little bit predictable, which I think is important, especially when you're in a huge state that has, many, many schools, and there's independent and public and traditional, and there's so many options for you, that I do like the standardization of having something that is going to be more predictable, especially when you're thinking about a family who might be new to Massachusetts, to the public school system as well.
When we work with schools at K-12, it's not just about furniture or design. It's about impact. Our radically student-centered approach puts students at the center of every decision. From that first conversation to the final walkthrough, we're focused on creating spaces that actually work for the kids, the teachers, and the community. So if you're looking to do more than just check a box on your next project, let's talk. Visit K12.com. That's KAY-TWELVE.com and see how we're helping schools transform learning one student at a time. Because at K-12, it's not just about projects and furniture, it's about purpose.
It goes back to this idea of big decisions early, documenting them in a way that you can go back to as you make the sort of funnel of smaller decisions, and make sure that they're reinforcing those early decisions. And that planning process really does allow for that back check to make sure that everything's reinforcing the larger planning goal. The other thing is that often we're not changing behavior. We are supporting behaviors that are already happening. I believe that educational spaces can either support great education, or they can kind of hinder it, but that it's happening, right? The teachers are doing it. They just are either helped along the way and able to do it a little bit better because of that, or the spaces are hindering them. And the students, same thing, right? And in spaces that are full of natural light, that have great acoustics, that have the teaching technology they need, these are supporting the student learning. It's happening anyway, but these factors do have impact and have impacts on performance. That is felt by everybody within those spaces. But I don't know that we're changing behavior so much as supporting it, and in doing so, making it easier for it to be elevated.
I think making it easier for to take risks too, right? When you're in this environment that is something new, it's being reinvested, being rebuilt in. Sometimes educators, they're free to, well, I have this new furniture in front of me. I'm going to try something silly, I'm going to try something
Right.
different. And that right there can really spark so much engagement and so much passion in a classroom, which is wonderful to see. So we were talking a little bit about higher ed, and I'm very curious about your thoughts, envision planning differences between doing that in a higher ed and then doing that, pre-K to 12.
I've given some thought to this. The decision makers are different, right? I mean, K to 12 are, in Massachusetts anyway, and I think in a lot of states, are committee-based decision makers. Whereas in higher ed, it can vary, but there's often a powerful teaching who's behind the project, and it's more singular in terms of its source of decision making. And that makes a huge difference. Another big difference is budgets are different because the ambitions are different, right? School, K through 12, projects have needs, districts have needs, and those needs really need to be met, so that they can educate their kids to the highest quality. Higher ed, a lot of what we're looking at is driven by ambition and by drawing the strongest students, drawing the strongest faculty. There's a very different level of ambition within the project, and that manifests itself. Furniture is also a place where K to 12 is very different than the furniture in higher ed spaces, and I think that can have a big impact on how the spaces are used.
Absolutely. I love that. I really wasn't thinking about that that competitiveness almost, where the pre-K through 12, industry is a little bit less. It's a little bit like the schools are there and we're rebuilding them, and there's definitely shine. But yeah, that ambitiousness, or what's going to set you apart, especially currently when the attendance and, the
Absolutely.
in higher ed has gone down,
Absolutely.
tremendously.
I mean, there's still a great deal of pride in K to 12 work, and
Yeah.
the schools the districts build, they take great pride in, and they're beautiful projects. But it is a different driver.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we kind of close and reflect, radically student centered, what is one takeaway that you would want audiences to come away with when thinking about designing radically student centered environments?
So much of the K to 12 work is really district driven, and so what it means to be radically student centered is very different in one district than another. And so the capacity to ask questions, the capacity to not know, and to really listen and let what you hear impact the designs, that will lead to more student centric projects and more appropriate projects for individual districts.
Absolutely. That's great advice. My next question, HMFH builds with purpose. That was something that they were very clear about. And so they asked, they design, and they learn with purpose. And so I ask you, what is your individual purpose? Or maybe what motivates you to get up every day and do your job in the K to 12 realm?
I love solving problems. I tackle every problem from the hardest part of it to the easiest part of it, because once you've done that, it's all easy. The breadth of my work, from working with superintendents and leading or co-leading visioning processes to detailing complicated exterior details, is really broad. But it's that desire to figure out where the sticking points are and dive in, I find really exciting.
Thank you so much for sharing. That's a very nice sentiment to end on. I'm going to thank everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you, James, your expertise and your insights today. It was a pleasure learning with you. If listeners would like to hear more or share their own radically student-centered moments, we invite you to like, comment, and share at betterlearningpodcast.com.
Thank you, Jessica. This was fun.
Thank you.
The Better Learning Podcast is produced by Matt Rogers and edited by Kelly Jones. The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily represent the perspectives of their affiliated companies, organizations, or associations.